I would like to start by acknowledging that we currently are gathered on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and by honoring the sovereignty of the 6 nations, the Mohawk, the Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora. These territories are covered by the Treaty of Canandaigua and the Buffalo Creek Treaty. This land acknowledgement is derived from respect for the treaties that were made on these territories and out of remorse for the harms and mistakes of the far and recent past. May we all pledge to work toward partnership with Indigenous people who still live on these lands in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Welcome. I'm Dr. Becky Craig. I'm Chair of Religious Studies and Theology, and I thank you all for coming this evening to a talk about which I am very, very excited. I also want to thank our many sponsors. I'm not going to list them all because they're all on the handout and there are a lot of them, but I want to acknowledge in particular Borders and Migration and the work that they did, especially in creating this beautiful flyer and for helping me to promote the talk. I am now going to turn things over to the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Thomas Chambers, who will introduce our speaker for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky, or if we're talking about Haudenosaunee land, I probably should say Nyahweh. Thank you. It's my pleasure this evening to welcome to Canisius College Dr. Deborah Kanter, Professor of History at Albion College in Albion, Michigan. She took her PhD and her master's degree in history at the University of Virginia, and her bachelor's degree at the University of Michigan. She teaches courses in Latin American history, Mexican history, Mexican American history, and especially for our theme of borders and migration and immigration. She has a long list of publications, which includes the 2009 book from the University of Texas Press, Hijos de Pueblo, Gender, Family, and Community in Rural Mexico, a number of book chapters, journal articles, conference presentations, some of those on Espanol, demonstrating her facility at language. She has given talks at the American Historical Association, Urban History Association, the Catholic History Association, and a host of others. In addition to those really, really impressive credentials, I can say from personal experience that Dr. Kanter is a tremendous scholar, a wonderful colleague, and a fine teacher. She and I shared an office next door to each other at Albion College almost 20 years ago, so we're both showing a little bit of our age. But I was a brand new faculty member, my first full-time job, and Deborah was a tremendous mentor and friend. And for that, I give her thanks. But today, we're lucky to hear from someone who has done a tremendous amount of research that is relevant to the world we live in. As Buffalo changes, as many of its parishes change, as many of those sacred spaces now are no longer used by the people that they were once designed and built for, or even used as churches in some cases. That transformation of churches and of the diocese is something that's happening here, and it's already happened in places like Chicago to an even greater extent. She's done research in Mexico, she's done research in the United States, she's done research in church basements, in old parishes, and has been to probably more church suppers and potlucks than most historians have, which is good ethnographic research. But I think you're going to enjoy the talk we have here tonight. I think it'll be informative to not only our experience as students of religious history and religious studies, but also as people of faith experience the transformation of the Catholic Church today. So, without any further ado, please welcome to Canisius College to speak about Chicago Católico, Professor Deborah Kanter.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. Nice turnout. I know we're competing with sports events and honors. It's gone to see the Harriet Tubman movie without me. That's what I also wish I was doing tonight. I want to thank Tom Chambers, Dean Chambers, for inviting me, the Department of Religious Studies, my host, Dr. Becky Craig, and Professor Richard Ritzma from the Spanish department, who isn't here, but informed me about a lot of things before coming. And it's a great privileged to be part of the Borders and Migrations Initiative. Was anybody at the talk by the Libro Traficante, Tony Diaz? I was like, wow, I'm on a poster with him, and he's famous, so that was cool. I'm thrilled to meet you all and to share my work at Canisius. This is actually the first leg of 3 stops at Jesuit institutions this month of November and December. 2 weeks from tonight, I will be at Georgetown and DC, and 3 weeks after that, I will be at Cristo Rey High School on the southwest side of Chicago. So the Jesuits like what I'm doing. Couple questions, because I want to have a little sense of who's in the room. Who in this room speaks Spanish? Raise your hand. Okay. And who has been to Chicago? Oh, well, that's good. Okay. So a couple facts to just sort of set things up about this project, and the book is coming out in February. Chicago has had permanent Mexican settlements for 100 years now. And I think that's surprising to a lot of people. They assume that Mexican people live in Los Angeles and they live in Texas and Arizona. Well, they started out in Chicago around a century ago. They came up during the Great War, and many people have stayed. And today, Chicago is the 2nd largest Mexican city in the United States. Which, like, even though I've known that for 15 years, it still kind of blows my mind that that is the case. And I would also add, I'm a native Chicagoan. I've been watching these changes going on. When I was a kid and my mother took me, because of my Spanish class, to the Mexican neighborhood, I thought there was 1 Mexican neighborhood. There were like 2, there were like 3. And now as I drive across the city, it's like neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood is Mexican, Puerto Rican, Ecuadorian, etc. So I'm going to not read a lot, but I'm going to give you a little taste of the book, and then we're going to go into a lot of images, and I would welcome questions and your additions. So my book tells the story of how Mexicans have made a home in Chicago and its churches. Today, Mexicans and other Latinos are transforming the Archdiocese of Chicago into Chicago Católico in ways that past generations of German and Irish bishops, priests, and sisters could never have imagined. I use the Catholic parish to view Mexican immigration and transformation in the United States. For individuals arriving from Mexico, these parishes served as a refugio, a refuge. Mexicans fiercely attach themselves to specific parishes, much like European ethnic roots in days gone by. And Buffalo, New York is clearly a city with lots of historic ethnic parishes. The Italians, the Irish, the Germans, the Poles, I think Hungarians also, which Chicago didn't have them, but whatever. These ethnic parishes were a place to speak Spanish, a place to reminisce about Mexico. At the same time, these parishes, I find, had an Americanizing influence on Mexican members. Men and women took part in regular devotions and parish activities in ways quite similar to Polish, Italian, or Irish Catholics elsewhere in Chicago. Their children participated in May crownings of the Virgin Mary, and they played baseball on parish sports teams. At the same time, many Mexican-American lay people gained a sense of Mexicanidad by participating in its religious and social events. The parish, I argue, acted as a glue that connected immigrant parents and their U.S.-reared children. My research stretches and expands Chicano history narratives that often minimize the role that religion played in everyday lives. Chicano history, with its activist and secular bent, has often marginalized the place of religion for Mexican people in the United States. I am kind of second wave of doing Mexican American history of the Midwest, and the first wave of books, which came out about 30 years ago. You would think that every Mexican immigrant, all they did in their leisure time was hang out in billiard parlors. Lots and lots of descriptions of billiard parlors. And I was sort of theorizing 20 years ago, I wonder if they ever went to church. Yeah, well, they did. Mexican immigrants to Chicago were much more than hog butcherers to the world. track workers, mill hands, and factory workers. They had families, they built communities, they formed sports teams, and they went to the movies. And Mexicans certainly went to Mass. Religious life countered their often racialized subordination as workers. And we are going to step back 100 years ago to 1918. And has anybody ever encountered retablos before? People know what those are? Well, I brought you one. So I'm going to pass this around. Props. So retablos are a traditional form of devotional art, thanking a saint or thanking the Virgin Mary for divine protection and divine help. This kind of religious art, and they're done, traditionally they're done on pieces of tin, and the person who received the help from the Virgin Mary painted and probably drew this himself to tell his story. And this is a story that goes back to November of 1918, and it is the story of a man named Matias Lara. Matias Lara arrived in Chicago in 1918, and he could not find the place that he was trying to find. And he kind of freaked out. We could see all the traffic and the big buildings, right? He probably stepped off a train in the Loop in Chicago. And he was so freaked out that he prayed to the Virgin of San Juan de los Lagos, who he is pictured with. And notably, Matias painted himself wearing overalls. He was a working man. And so imagine showing up in overalls in the middle of the Loop in Chicago in November. It's probably cold. So this is what he wrote on his retablo. Finding myself lost in Chicago, I entrusted myself to the Virgin of San Juan de los Lagos, asking that she illuminate the road that I sought. I give her thanks for having granted me what I asked, and I dedicate the present offering as a commemoration. So we've got Mexicans arriving in Chicago 100 years ago. They have their Catholic faith. They have their devotion to national saints and images like the Virgin of Guadalupe, but also to regional ones. What they didn't have 100 years ago was they didn't have like a clear community, and they definitely did not have religious spaces that were designed to harbor and welcome them. Matias Lara was part of the very first wave of people who showed up in the Midwest 100 years ago. Here are a couple other scenarios of people who came in the teens, the 20s, 30s, and 40s. The image of the family was taken in Saginaw, Michigan in the 1920s. These were people who came up to Michigan to do summer migrant work, working in sugar beets. And if you really know Spanish, you might recognize the word betabel. Betabel is a beet, or a sugar beet. And the people who worked in sugar beets were betabaleros. And I just love saying that word, so you learned something. That Saginaw family, that Mexican family, they worked probably a couple seasons, but what they found out was they could get industrial jobs in Chicago or Detroit, and they moved there after a couple years. That was a much better option, especially because the Mexican Catholic churches were getting founded there. A lot of Mexicans who arrived early in the Midwest came as track workers. They worked on railroads, and there was a huge influx of railroad workers in the 1940s, World War II, the Bracero program, which brought Mexican men in as temporary contract workers to support the war effort. And it was usually on railroads that people arrived in Chicago. This is one of the maps in my book, and a couple things here. So the lake, the Loop, historic downtown. We've got major railway lines, which were the ways that people arrived. This was one area of settlement, South Chicago, steel industry. And this was the other primary area, which became the largest Mexican neighborhood in Chicago. Chicago's near West Side, and we're going to be talking about that for a few moments. And the near West Side was the place where one of the two Mexican churches were founded in Chicago. So Chicago had two churches for Spanish-speaking people until about the 1960s, and then it begins to increase. The process of building a Mexican identity and community well beyond the Southwest began in these two Chicago neighborhoods, these two Chicago parishes, in the 1920s. And there was one religious order that was quite responsible for what happened. The Claritian Missionary Fathers. This was an order which was founded in Spain. They arrived in the United States around 1902. First they missionized to Mexican immigrants in Texas, Arizona. But by the 1920s, they heard that there were 3,000 Mexicans in Chicago. And the Claritians went to talk to the Archbishop of Chicago, and they said, like, what can we do? We want to come and serve these people. And there were deals cut, and in one case, the Claritians got to build a brick and mortar church from the ground up, Our Lady of Guadalupe, which still exists in the South Chicago neighborhood. They took over St. Francis of Assisi Church. This was a church that had been founded by German immigrants in the 1870s. And St. Francis, its German membership in the 1920s, the German membership was declining. The Germans were moving out to newer neighborhoods. The priest was really worried what he was going to do when the furnace blew, right? How was he going to keep the building going? There were some Mexican children that were enrolling in the parish school, a couple Mexican altar boys. There was a little tiny bit of some entry into the parish. The archdiocese handed the parish over to the Spanish-speaking Claritian missionaries, and in 1926, the first Mass in Spanish. I want to qualify that. The first Mass for the Spanish-speaking. The Mass was in Latin, right? But the Claritians would give the homily in Spanish, the hymns would be in Spanish, the rosary would be in Spanish, etc. And so the first Mass for the Mexican arrivals was in 1926. And anybody notice anything in the 1940s photograph of the sanctuary? Anybody with a good eye?
Virgin of Guadalupe.
That is the Virgin of Guadalupe. So, and it was the Church of St. Francis of Assisi, so we got a little St. Francis, hanging out up there. But soon after taking over the church, they raised money and they put in the altar to the Virgin of Guadalupe. And very early, 1927, they were doing the 12-night novena for the Virgin of Guadalupe in a big celebration on December 12th. From the 1920s through the 1960s, St. Francis, which was the church, the rectory, the school, the convent, and they built a gym, it provided a lively and nurturing home for Mexican immigrants and Mexican American young people. Those young people may have grown up in poverty, but with a parish to call their own, they did not feel marginalized. The Mexican church anchored the community, and its children grew up with a positive grounding in Mexican and American Catholic traditions. This experience would manifest itself as thousands of Mexican origin people left that neighborhood because of things like urban renewal, and they went out to live in new neighborhoods and found themselves entering new parishes which were not for Spanish-speaking people. And while this church still stands today, and it's very popular, it runs about 8 masses every weekend. It's very popular with new immigrants from a lot of Spanish-speaking countries. But this church, it has almost been torn down many times, and it faced real uncertainty. In about 1962, the University of Illinois decided that they would build their Chicago campus across the street from St. Francis, and that removed all of the Mexican bakeries and all the Mexican grocery stores and the Mexican movie theater and housing for probably 10 to 15,000 Mexican people, and also some Greek and Italians. The church persisted, people kept coming back on Sundays, but that neighborhood has never been the same. And one of the neighborhoods that Mexicans moved into was a neighborhood called Pilsen. By the way, I think it might be Forbes that says that Pilsen is one of the 10 hottest neighborhoods in the world. So you'll want to go. It's hot. So there's a lot of things going on there. The Pilsen neighborhood is one of the very oldest neighborhoods in Chicago. This was a neighborhood that was not touched by the Chicago fire in 1873. So you've got housing stock there that goes back to like the 1860s. These are like, there are not many buildings like this in the rest of the city. I'm going to show you a few things here. So the Loop and then Pilsen about maybe 1.5 miles, 2 miles to the southwest. There's St. Francis that I was just talking about. Pilsen runs, it's kind of a narrow swath of the neighborhood, running along 18th Street, railroad lines here, shipping stuff down here, so there were jobs for men in these two areas. This neighborhood, after 1915, it had 13 churches, 13 Catholic churches. I'm not talking about the Methodist. 13 parishes because there were people who spoke a lot of different languages in this neighborhood. So if we start over here, Providence of God was founded by the Lithuanians. St. Joseph's was Slovak. St. Procopius was founded by the Czechs. Holy Trinity was a Croatian parish. The Croatians and the Slovaks do not hang out together. St. Adalbert was basically like a Polish cathedral, backing up on the railroad tracks. St. Vitus was Czech. St. Paul was German. Well, I can make this up because you don't really know, right? One of these is St. Michael's Italian. The other one is St. Stephen's Slovenian. I had to learn about Slovenian speech, right? St. Anne's was Polish. So basically, in the Pilsen neighborhood, you can stand on certain street corners or stand up on the elevated train platform, and there's like 4 church steeples like right around you. They're everywhere. And eventually what would happen was the neighborhood became a majority Mexican neighborhood. And some of these older Slavic groups started moving out. A lot of my book is the story of people beginning to make those moves. And I was looking for the very first evidence I could find of Mexican people moving into these churches that belonged to Polish folks, Czech folks, Lithuanian. I was envisioning that it was maybe a very uncomfortable experience to be the first Mexicano to walk in, maybe in your overalls before going to the train yards, or maybe in a suit on Sunday. But I was always kind of envisioning like that people would be stared at by the Poles and the Czechs and this and that. I was going through parish bulletins from St. Pius Church, and I was going through like 1944 and 1945, and I'm looking for a needle in a haystack, and I found it. Mass intentions for this week in 1947, somebody wanted a mass done to thank the Virgin of San Juan de los Lagos, the same regional Virgin Mary that Matias Lara had expressed his devotion to in 1918. So there was I found my needle in the haystack. It was like that. But there are these occasional days in the archive. You think you might find something, and you can be looking for a long time and not find anything. Mexicans began to move into this neighborhood in sort of a steady stream of people in the 1950s. They found that Polish and Lithuanian landlords would rent apartments to them. They found that real estate brokers would sell houses to them, but they also had some uneasy moments settling down in the neighborhood and entering these parishes. Because it was a white and very like ethnic enclave sort of neighborhood. And one of the big issues going on in 1950 Chicago, like everywhere in the northern United States in this time period, there was another large group of people moving into northern industrial cities, African Americans, right? And that was who a lot of white folk were pretty concerned with. And so we have this little Catholic Charities report from Chicago about this Pilsen neighborhood. And Catholic Charities wrote that Mexicans are still viewed as invaders by the older residents, many of whom still retain their own ethnic outlook and language. However, the Mexican is considered a much lesser evil than the surrounding Negroes. And it's not even a hypothesis because I've found plenty of evidence. The parish priests are so concerned about what if the parish turns black, right? Because most of the African Americans are not Catholic, and you're not going to be able to keep the parish going. And they're worried, of course, real estate prices will go down. So the priests are often in the Pilsen neighborhood the ones who seem to tell their parishioners, like, the Mexicans are Catholic, like they'll come to church, so please rent to them. And it's a much lesser evil situation. People are not necessarily thrilled that Mexicans are moving in, but they're willing to accept them. By 1960, 62, you've got parish priests at many of these parishes who are scrambling to learn Spanish. They will often take their youngest pastor and send him to Mexico for 3 months. If they can't afford to do that, or if they can't afford to lose him for 3 months or 6 months, they would send him to Berlitz Language School in downtown Chicago and, do a 1 month quick trying to learn Spanish. So you've got this sort of like, this change going on, the neighborhood is shifting, rising proportions of Mexicans, and about half of the parishes recognize they've got to change up their game if they're going to include these people, if they're going to get money put in the collection basket, and if they're going to keep their doors open. Some of the first pioneers in these Catholic parishes were the children. These are 2 photos from St. Adalbert. St. Adalbert's was a huge Catholic, a huge Polish parish in this neighborhood. I think that St. Adalbert's was a little uneasy about really welcoming Mexicans, but they definitely enrolled Mexican children in the school. And so the photo from 1960, Americans All, right? See a little thing on the board in the back there. These are almost all Polish American children. Some of the kids would have been Polish refugee children coming from deported people's camps. But we can see a few faces. There's a few people who stick out. She's, to me, the obvious one. Maybe this one is Mexican, maybe this one, maybe this one. The rest of them are, this big sea of white Polish faces. By 1974, the game had really started to change at St. Adalbert's. And here we've got, Vincent Ramirez, Victor Rodriguez, Herman Vasquez, etc. There's still some Polish people, right? Donald, okay, I'm not going to do that. They've got tough Polish names. Stephen Ropa, okay, we got that. So, and it was around this time, around 1974, that St. Adalbert brought an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe into the church and started to do Spanish Mass. Another form of pioneers coming into the neighborhood would be Mexican businesses. Some of these were businesses from that old St. Francis neighborhood. When the apartment buildings get bulldozed, you don't have so many people to go to your bakery anymore, right? So this is the Bonilla family who had operated El Nopal Bakery in the near West Side neighborhood, and they moved their business to Pilsen. This is a nopal, by the way, a prickly pear cactus, a very historic sort of sign of Mexicanidad. You'd be kind of thinking, what do prickly pear cactuses and baked goods have to do with each other? But it was like the Bonilla family signifying to Mexican shoppers, we're like muy Mexicano. And Mr. Bonilla, by the way, his first job in Chicago, he worked at the Palmer House Hotel, the grand dame of a hotel in the Loop, and he worked in the bakery there. And started gathering up a little money and opened up his own bakery. This is the day in 1961 that the Bonillas purchased the Ace Bakery from Mr. Fritz. Who doesn't like to look that happy, but I don't know, it's Ace Bakery. So, anything that people notice about this photograph? Anything stand out? How about the priest in the middle of the photograph, right? That was Father Bianchi from St. Francis of Assisi, the big Catedral Mexicana. And the Bonillas had been parishioners at St. Francis, and when they were taking over this business, they wanted him there to bless their establishment of the new El Nopal Bakery. And I saw this picture and I was like, I need this picture for my book. And I cultivated a relationship with little Frank, who's, like 56 years old, right? And he was obliged, so the photograph is going to be in the book. The bakery today is no longer El Nopal. The sign still exists. If you go to Pilsen, you will still see the sign. And now it's kind of like a yuppie hipster bakery. And they have some nice Mexican touches. And that fancy pastry, that stuff, the original, probably from like the 19-teens, is still there. They have kept a lot of things there. And a lot of the parishes in Pilsen, the installation of the Virgin of Guadalupe was usually a turning point. And this is a little bit about the families that installed the Virgin of Guadalupe at St. Anne's, another Polish church. This neighborhood has plenty of Polish churches. Let's see, we have got, and I've interviewed like way too many people in the photos. So this is Lupe and her husband Matt Almendares. They had been St. Francis people. They were some of the first Mexican people to move into St. Anne's Parish. They had been in the parish for probably 10 years at this point. Lupe was part of the Mothers Club. Matt wanted to join the Holy Name, but there were a few little problems. But anyways, they worked with another family to donate the image that they're carrying. As they recalled, it came from Mexico with papers and all. Matt actually constructed the little litter that they carried the saint on, and Lupe and Matt were selected to carry the image, joining the couple that donated it through the nearby streets. The two couples proudly carried the Virgin of Guadalupe on a 2-block procession, led by a priest before entering St. Anne's sanctuary. For decades, the image remained prominently displayed by the main altar, parallel to Our Lady of Częstochowa, the Polish version. Taking part in the procession and the installation felt beautiful, according to the Almendares parents. Soon after, Mexican parishioners purchased a Mexican flag to place by the Virgin's side. The installation of the Mexican version marked a change to Mexicans and Poles alike. And their daughter, Lisa, recalled that Polish people realized that you weren't going anywhere. So, that's one of my favorite lines. Lisa, as a young Mexican-American teen at that parish, she was a musician. She played the folk guitar, masses. She had plenty of Polish friends. That school ended up becoming a very mixed place. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Julia, who is standing proudly here. Julia Rodriguez. I interviewed her when she was in her 80s. She had moved to Chicago around 1955. She'd been in Chicago for like 45 years, and right before we did our oral history, she said to me, "Perdóname, pero yo no hablo inglés muy bien. I'm sorry, I don't really speak English that well. Podemos hacer la entrevista en español?" I was like, yeah, we can do it. So she had a very kind of folkloric sort of Spanish, like stuff I never hear anywhere. She was from the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. And that's a pretty isolated, pretty impoverished community. She had not gone to school very much. Her family were migratory cotton pickers. She told me stories about, moving to Mississippi and Alabama and this and that when she was a kid, and that she only completed a few years of school in Texas. When she came to Chicago, they lived very close to the Czech parish, and which was called St. Procopius. And her memory of going into those first masses, los polacos como que no. With the Poles, with the Slavs, no way. Like, she felt like they were giving her kind of like the stink eye. Nobody ever said anything to her, but she didn't feel comfortable. And as much as she could, she would take kids on the bus and they go back to St. Francis, where she felt at home. We fast forward her story 20 years later, and she was chosen with her husband and some children from St. Procopius to take this portrait of the Virgin of Guadalupe and to bring her as a gift to the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Richard J. Daley. Considering Julia's impoverished childhood, this photo expresses an adulthood of stability, respectability, faith, and belonging. Julia stood proudly as a Mexican-American Catholic with the pinnacle of her adopted city, the mayor, who was himself a Catholic. He was like super famous. He went to Mass every morning before he went to City Hall. With her husband Ruben and the parish children, she represented St. Procopius. 2 days earlier, she hesitated to attend Mass there. Los polacos como que no. In 1976, St. Procopius was her home. Chicago had usually been willing to give a chance to Mexicans, fellow Catholics, who, like the Irish, Czechs, Poles, and Lithuanians, also expressed their devotion to the Virgin Mary. Pilsen became Chicago's first majority Mexican neighborhood in the 1970s, and these Mexican Catholic voices grew louder. Just months after Julia's visit to the mayor's office, 7 parishes in Pilsen came together and they mounted the neighborhoods and maybe the cities, definitely the neighborhoods first, Via Crucis, a living way of the cross, a Good Friday devotion. I don't really want to call it a celebration because it does not feel celebratory. It's very kind of, it's solemn, and often it's raining or it's snowing. For months leading up to this observance, which goes on for hours, the 7 parishes come together. They decide who is going to get to play the parts in this reenactment of Jesus' last day. The men who are participating grow out their beards. A lot of them will start doing it early because they're really hoping they're going to get picked to be Jesus. So that's a whole thing. The 7 parishes take over 18th Street, and these events differ very greatly in tone and message, and show the rise of a Chicago Católico. They make a Good Friday that no one ever forgets in Chicago. Priests and laity collaborated in creating a new kind of Catholic ritual for Chicago. This Via Crucis harked back to colonial Mexican rituals and simultaneously reflected the urban Chicano experience. So they did the first Via Crucis in 1977, and they're still doing it. And in Chicago, and here's a more recent Pilsen Via Crucis. The date's bad there. Yeah, that one's like from 2013 or 2015. They shut traffic on this major artery for like 5 hours. The bus route has to be diverted. People show up not just from that neighborhood, but surrounding neighborhoods to walk along with the procession. Mexican Catholics literally take over the streets to walk together with Jesus. The Via Crucis epitomizes the flowering of a Hispanic liturgy that draws upon devotional practices with deep roots in Mexico's religious life. At the same time, these practices have been adapted to reflect the realities of immigrants and Mexican descent Chicagoans. The Via Crucis proclaimed Pilsen as a Mexican and Catholic space in a neighborhood dominated just 15 years earlier by Poles, Czechs, and Lithuanians. Unprecedented, the Via Crucis reflected lofty goals of engaging issues of social justice and embodied an identity at once Catholic, Mexican, and Chicano. These days in Chicago, Via Crucis happen in about 15 locations. The little village neighborhood about a mile to the west of there, again, it's sort of like 5 parishes coming together and very much emulating this. You have suburban parishes that do an outdoor Via Crucis. You know, suburban parishes that 25 years ago were white suburban parishes, and these days are usually like bicultural parishes. And to me, as I was working on this project, the end point for the project to me was 1977. The Via Crucis just reflected such a huge transformation. And I keep going a little bit, but this is sort of the culmination for me. But if we think about the last 100 years, Julia Rodriguez's portrait with the mayor and Pilsen's Via Crucis both expressed a strong Mexican and Catholic identity in 1970s Chicago. But both of these events were completely unimaginable in the 1920s when people like Matias in the overalls and other Mexicans arrived in Chicago. Today, Chicago is the second largest Mexican metropolis in the United States and home to a new urban mestizo culture with an identity that spans 2 nations. The making of Mexican parishes helped generations of immigrants create new homes and identities, first at St. Francis of Assisi, and then in the past half-century at parishes across Pilsen. Mexican people, I argue, remake more than specific parishes. They're also really remaking neighborhoods. And this is a super prominent mural in the Pilsen neighborhood. You get a little sense, I think, of how big this mural is. I think this building is 4 stories tall. It was commissioned by St. Pius Church across the street. And this mural, like, so beautifully situated above John's Lavanderia. That's like a very Pilsen thing, right? So John's Lavanderia. It's not a laundromat, it's a lavanderia. So this neighborhood has a lot of lavanderias because not very many people can afford to have washing machines. It's still very much a working poor neighborhood, but we've got the Virgin of Guadalupe watching over people crossing the Rio Grande. We've got that generation of immigrant parents working in service jobs, in construction, I guess, healthcare, and then, you know, their children who are graduating from high school and graduating from college. I teach Mexican American history at LD College now, and about half of my students are Latinx students. And the last time I taught this mural, I had several students from the south side of Chicago start talking about what this mural meant to them, that they would be on their way to high school, like on the bus or driving with their family to go by this mural, and they would say that it inspired them to like keep going. It reminded them of the sacrifices that their parents had made and, you know, the path that they wanted to pursue. In episodes Small and Large, my book demonstrates how a committed Mexican laity partnering with sympathetic Euro-American clergy indelibly stamped Pilsen as Católico, Catholic, and Mexican. They transformed entire neighborhoods and have impacted the entire archdiocese, resulting in a Chicago Católico. This started off in the 1920s with just 2 churches. And this is a screenshot from the Archdiocese's website. I did a search. Where can you go to Mass in Spanish within the city of Chicago? At all of these churches, right? And this is just the city of Chicago. If I was able to, I couldn't do the whole Archdiocese, but the Archdiocese includes suburbs, right? So there is Mass in Spanish in a whole ring of suburbs. In 2015, Misa en Español was celebrated at 130 parishes in the Archdiocese of Chicago. That's 37% of the archdiocese. So we've got this movement into the suburbs. And I'm going to finish off with a quote from a scholar at Boston College, a theologian named Hosman Ospino. He says, thanks to Hispanics and many parts of the country, U.S. Catholicism is de facto a bilingual reality. This saga of Latinos reshaping, often revitalizing parishes, plays out all over the United States. Thank you. Questions?
I'm so glad that you're here because I have a million questions, but I'll try to restrain myself to just 2 questions there. First, particularly for the early immigrants to Chicago from Mexico, did you notice any particular regional origin? They're coming from a certain part of Mexico, so that'll be one question, and then that continued to today. And the other question I can't resist asking, remember in the 1930s, there were these mass expulsions of Mexicans there. Did that impact Chicago? Did that not take place there? Or did it affect the life of the people, of the Mexican people? Those are the 2 big questions that I have for you.
Good questions. Mexicans came from certain regions. There was a lot coming from the center-west of Mexico, Jalisco, Michoacan, Guanajuato. Notably, that Virgin of San Juan we started with early, she is from that region. And so people coming back to Mexico, they always go to visit her shrine. And they always bring their little knickknacks with them back to Chicago, back to Los Angeles, back to the state of Washington. The Virgin of San Juan is like anywhere there is a Mexican immigrant. These days, the sort of regionality has really opened up a lot. And about the 1930s. So in the 1930s, when the Depression hit, local governments did not want to hold on to Mexicans because they did not want to give them, welfare. They didn't want to give them free bread, whatever. They wanted to reserve the good jobs for European Americans. So these Mexicans were often the first peoples that lost their jobs. For example, like Ford Motor Company in Detroit, you had local governments working with Washington, and Washington then worked with the Mexican government, and they set up a bilateral agreement. The U.S. government would offer people free transportation from Detroit, from Los Angeles. They'd put them on trains, and they would take them to the Mexican border. They didn't have to pay anything. And then the Mexican government was supposedly supposed to transport them back to their home regions. One of the things that this did was you had these immigrant parents, but they had American-born children. So in this repatriation, as it was called, and I think we have another word we use in the United States today for repatriation, deportations, right? Repatriation makes it sound like everybody wanted to go back, right? I'll tell you who definitely did not want to go back were the children born in places like Detroit and Los Angeles. Like, they didn't even, and half of them didn't speak Spanish, right? So these were like forced deportations of American citizens. Certain cities got hit really bad. I mentioned Detroit and Los Angeles. Detroit lost about 50% of its population, its Mexican population. Some of this was voluntary. People, I can't pay my bills, I can't heat the apartment, I guess I'm going back to the rancho and I'll live with, mis hermanos, mis papás, right? Chicago did not get hit bad. And I think what happened there was that local government, which was really Catholic, this is a little hypothetical, but local government just did not push this. So there were people who voluntarily left, times are tough, can't pay the bills, trying to get by on 2 shifts a week at the steel mill. But a lot of people stayed, and I think the churches were helpful for them. Catholic Charities, the St. Vincent de Paul Society, gave a lot of aid to Mexicans through these churches in the 1930s, and probably won the battle against the Protestants for Mexican souls because of them.
May I ask you something about education in the area. How was Catholic education in Chicago? How was that affect? How did that affect the Mexicans in the area, or were they mainly educated in the public system in Chicago?
I think that the majority, I mean, so this is a little problem with my research. I started doing parishes, not really because I wanted to do parishes. I wanted to learn about Mexican community formation and Mexican identity. And I chose parishes. I figured like, oh, I'll probably get a lot of information. I think they go to church a lot, right? So I started going to like church reunions and Catholic school reunions. So who do I meet? People who are very connected with Catholic parishes. I know I talked to a disproportionate number of people who graduated from Catholic schools. And, but I've talked to older people who were also publicans. And you know what? It's my sense that Catholic education for Mexican American kids in Chicago, it often gave them a leg up and a way to get into something more white collar. There was this whole stream of Mexican young men going into the fire department and going into the police department. Some of this had to do with Catholic schools and with these parish priests having connections into those agencies. The Claritian order, who was overseeing things at St. Francis, that's the order that also oversees the National Shrine to St. Jude. And there was a very, very famous, enormous St. Jude's Police League in Chicago. And they would have, you know, masses with, you know, 7,000 Catholic policemen. And this put a lot of money into the coffers of these Mexican churches. So there are just some very interesting links, I think, between, you know, the Catholic parishes, the Catholic schools, and then like entering the sort of hallowed halls of Catholic power in City Hall and other agencies like that.
If you're familiar with the Cristo Rey high schools, I believe they began in Chicago, and I think, but I'm not positive.
Yeah. And actually, one of the Cristo Reys was in an old Slovenian church in Pilsen. And it was a Slovenian church that never offered Mass in Spanish. They were enrolling those kids in their parochial school, but by not offering Mass in Spanish, as the neighborhood was becoming like 60% Mexican, 70%, 80% Mexican, they forced themselves to shut down. The Slovenians, they moved out to the suburbs. They have some fancy shrine out in some lily white place, God knows where. And it's super Slovenian out there. I follow them on Facebook. But they closed down, the building was empty, and that's the Cristo Rey inherited, you know, the parish complex. So, good from unwelcoming. Yeah. Other questions? Chicago questions? Parish questions? I'm just going to confess something. I don't think people usually ask me this in front of a group. I'm not Mexican and I'm not Catholic. So people are always a little confused about what a nice Jewish person from the Chicago suburbs is doing working on this project. And I'm a historian of Mexico by training. I had lived and worked in Mexico for like 4 years. I was very interested in these like popular religious things. I'd walk along with processions and I'd go to shrines, and I like am in love with looking at those retablos and people's things they leave with the Virgin Mary. And I realized that some of these same phenomenons had been transplanted or happening in Chicago. And I speak Spanish, and I'm willing to be brave and go to family reunions with families I don't belong to. And then people talk to me. And 19 years later, there's a book. Yeah?
Well, I'm just curious with some of the other cultural festivals, you know, we get them here, and as I recall, I think they're also in Chicago, things like Dingus Day and St. Patrick's Day and other things. Do the Mexican parishes also sort of end up participating in them if they're sharing space with the other groups, or you know, you sort of get a blending, or you still get pretty much, we'll do our own thing?
I think the question, well, okay, I can think of one example where you do have that kind of blending going on. There's a super famous, popular devotion to Our Lady of Mount Carmel amongst Italians and Italian Americans. And there's a parish out in Melrose Park, kind of a lower middle class suburb, so like you're heading out towards O'Hare. And Mexicans are easily, well, they're probably 60–70% of Melrose Park. So the Italians were out parading Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and I was kind of hanging out. All these Mexicans are like standing in front of their house watching the Italians go through the neighborhood, right? 5 years later, I'm reading the parish bulletin. People were invited to bring their Our Ladies of Guadalupe to join the Italians' procession. That struck me as a good move, right? So, but initially, like, I think the Mexicans in that neighborhood felt like, this is from the Italians. And, you know, even though it is the Virgin Mary, these days, like, the parish council is maybe 40% Mexican, 60% Italian surnamed. That seems to be a good story of integration. I would not be surprised if it has something to do with the priests. The priests are the ones who will encourage that kind of stuff. But like, you know, let's be honest, the Mexicans, they don't get super excited about Our Lady of Czestochowa. But there's plenty of Poles in Chicago who are actually pretty devoted to Our Lady of Guadalupe. They'll go on December 12th, and they will go on pilgrimage to Tepeyac in Mexico. So the first American bishop or archbishop to say Mass at the Basilica in Mexico City was actually, I think it was Cardinal George in Chicago. The Archdiocese is very big on encouraging these connections. So Chicago, by the way, this is a little beyond the geography of what I shared today. Chicago has its own Tepeyac. This is like the hillside where the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared. Now this is a little weird because Chicago doesn't have any hills. It's like really flat, right? But out in the suburbs, and like the origins of this are a little weird, devout people started, like they built like a fake hillside. You know, it would be like, I don't know, almost to the ceiling. And there's, you know, the Virgin is up on top, a statue, and then there's a Juan Diego down here. And oh my God, that place is, it's apparently the most visited pilgrimage place in the United States, according to that sanctuary. I don't know if that's actually true, but it strikes me as possible. And some people who go are not Mexican, but it's pretty Mexican there. And they're now doing Day of the Dead there along with the Virgin Guadalupe stuff. And you can, if you ever go, you can go on the 12th of any month and it is packed. So they got to commemorate the 12th every month. People are really into the liturgical calendar.
How many parishes simply closed?
So in Pilsen, it ended up being a very sad thing as I was finishing writing this book. When I started working on this project, so, you know, 19 years ago and even 10 years ago, there were 7 parishes in Pilsen. There had originally been 13. It was down to 7. There are 3 parishes that are left. This is, Mexican Americans will say this is about gentrification. The gringos are moving in and they're not religious. The gringos are moving in and they don't have children, right? And when they say the gringos are moving in, this is a neighborhood that used to be 95% Mexican. That's about, you know, 87% Mexican. It's still a pretty Mexican neighborhood. And, you know, the reality is also Mexican folks are having smaller families, just like other Americans. You know, the average family size is more like 2.2 children, right? The fact, you know, maybe they're not celebrating the Virgin of Guadalupe in Pilsen because maybe they're running out to that sanctuary with the mountain, right? And a lot of this has to do with, of course, these are aging buildings from the 1880s, 1890s, that are very hard to keep up, and the Archdiocese is really directing. In Chicago, the program is called Renew My Parish, which is you people have to sit in a room and decide which parishes you're going to close. So they put this on like the council, like the parish council leadership, and they'll get like 3 parishes in a process, and they have to have statistics, and then the Archdiocese kind of probably does whatever they were going to do anyhow, but they make it sound kind of democratic. So there's a lot of really sad people in Pilsen. I went to the closing of St. Pius this summer. I went to their final mass. And so this was the old Polish church, which became a Mexican church. And for that final mass, it was about 2/3 Polish Americans who came. And people were like really sad. And Mexican people were there and were really sad. And it was a trilingual mass, I guess. But I was going early and sort of overhearing conversations, and I heard 2 Mexican American women say, "Oh my God, all these churches closing. There's so much history in this neighborhood. Somebody should like write a history of this." So I went over with like my business card, you know. So, and it turned out I had already met their brother somewhere, but so right person, right time.
Is there evidence with the church closings that they're leaving the Catholic faith
Yes.
and going to the evangelical or Pentecostal churches?
So, you know, I think that at this point, there was recently like a report from, I don't know, National Catholic Reporter or whatever. Hispanics are no longer majority Catholic. I think it's sitting right at, I don't know, 49% or something. And some of it is the move to evangelical. With Mexicans, it is not, you know, in the story in Buffalo and in the Northeast is more a story of Dominican folks and Puerto Ricans. Those folks have been really drawn to evangelical churches, strong evangelical presence in Puerto Rico since the U.S. occupation in 1898. I think the evangelical push into Mexico and Mexican-American communities is less successful. It just, at this point, it feels like just so many people are just feeling disaffected. You know, it's the clergy sex scandal. People don't like the Archbishop living in a mansion, right? And then I hear all the time in Chicago, people say, I mean, this would be anywhere in the country, but I'm hearing in Chicago, oh, the reason they're shutting down our parishes is because they have to pay legal fees. So, and I think that there's just like, you know, there's still a lot of people with strong connections, but a lot of disaffected people as well. And they might be disaffected and they might not be attending Mass regularly, but they might also be wearing an amulet with Our Lady of Guadalupe, right? So they still have the faith, but you know, I think I'm feeling a little bit of a change in that neighborhood over the last 20 years. Hello.
Do you see any connection between the presence of Mexican Catholics and the Archdiocese of Chicago's relationship with Catholic social teaching and social justice and how that is lived?
Yeah, the Archdiocese of Chicago, I think, you know, it has been a pretty progressive archdiocese for a long time. There's definitely a lot of the hierarchy and parish priests standing up for like immigrants' rights. That is a really big thing. You know, sanctuary kind of stuff. The Archbishop speaking up very clearly that people like need to write to their congressional representatives and their senators. You know, you need to fight to save DACA and, you know, encouraging people to be active. I mean, the future of the Catholic Church in the United States is pretty reliant on immigrants. And, you know, not just Latin Americans, it might also be Vietnamese, right? Chinese, Koreans. I mean, Latin Americans are, you know, they're about, I think 40% of US Catholics have their roots in Latin America. You know, what's that gonna be, like another 15 years until it's actually the majority of Catholics in the United States that their family stories will be in Mexico and Cuba and Puerto Rico, right? Yeah. So yeah, definitely a lot of social justice kind of stuff. And the Cristo Rey schools, I think, are a really good example of that. How many people have heard of Cristo Rey schools? Okay. So I think there's about 20, maybe like 24 of them nationally. These are schools that were built and staffed in underserved neighborhoods that have a strong college preparedness component. In addition to that, the students who attend 1 day a week, they put on business clothes and they go and work in offices in downtown, and they have like real resumes when they're 18 because they have been out working for 4 years. They start raking in money because they can work like good summer jobs by the time they're 16 because they already have this work experience. Where's the closest Cristo Rey to Buffalo? Anybody know? So they keep on opening up schools, and I would urge you, anybody here working in admissions? You should get in with the Cristo Rey network. So we just got my little historically Methodist college, we just got on the list of partner schools for Cristo Rey, and there's about 5 of them, 6 Cristo Rey schools within like 3-4 hours from Albion, and I'm really hopeful that we're gonna start seeing more students from there. So. I have a Cristo Rey alum. We have Cristo Rey in Detroit, and Jennifer Gonzalez is my Cristo Rey alum. And I asked her to take me on a tour of the Mexican neighborhood in Detroit. So I drive up her street in Southwest Detroit. I'm like, which house number is hers? Well, it was a house with like a shrine this big to the Virgin of Guadalupe in the front yard. That was Jennifer's house. So it was pretty easy to pick up. Where'd my retablo end up? Is it somewhere? Okay, that's good. So I only have one of those. The book is, as you can see, it's available for pre-order. The press did me a solid. They designed a beautiful cover, and it's very affordable. And I will say one more thing about the book. So I decided I didn't want to write a book that was only going to be read by 20 of my colleague friends. And I decided to write a book that was going to be readable, and I wrote a book that tells stories. It has a lot of gossip. I learned to write in creative nonfiction, and I kept the jargon out of this book. And my goal was to write a book that you could give your mom or your grandma for Christmas. And I think that's the book that they published. So I've got bookmarks and flyers from the book on the table. Feel free. It's a nice bookmark. So thank you very much.